You know, when you picture a Roman emperor, you probably think of guys like Caesar or Augustus, conquering generals, grand empires, right? But the story of Emperor Justinian is different. It's a fascinating paradox, really. His military victories, which were a huge deal at the time, are mostly forgotten. But something else he did has lasted for centuries.
And our main source here, the historian Edward Gibbon, just nails it with this quote. He says that while Justinian's battle honors have crumbled into dust, his real legacy, his true victory, is something else entirely. A massive, everlasting monument made of law.
So why was this legal monument so much more important than any battlefield win? Well, to really get a feel for what Justinian pulled off, you first have to understand the absolute, total chaos of the legal system he inherited.
So just how bad was it? What was this legal mess Justinian was dealing with? I mean, imagine trying to run a country today, using a random mix of laws from the last 1,000 years, written by completely different governments with totally different beliefs. That's pretty much the nightmare Justinian had on his hands.
To put it mildly, Roman law wasn't a tidy system. No, it was a tangled, overgrown, contradictory mess of rules that had just been piling up for a millennium. Just look at how this thing grew over time. You had ancient laws from the very first Roman kings, then layered on top of that the super rigid 12 tables. Then you had the praetors, these city magistrates who issued new rules every single year, often contradicting the old ones. And for the final layer, centuries and centuries of imperial decrees. And the craziest part, all of it, every last bit, was still technically the law.
Another historian, Tertullian, called it a gloomy and intricate forest. And that's the perfect image, isn't it? Trying to find the right law was like being completely lost in the woods at night. Justice wasn't just hard to get, it was almost impossible to even figure out where to start.
And if you think that's confusing, it gets even weirder. The law wasn't just about what was written down. It had become what Gibbon calls an occult science. Like a secret society with its own bizarre rituals and specific hand gestures that you had to get right.
This system basically locked ordinary people out of justice. To do something as simple as file a claim, you had to perform this precise, weird little pantomime. And if you messed up a single step, say you broke the branch the wrong way, your whole case could be thrown out, no matter how right you were. It was a system for insiders, not for citizens.
So, how on earth do you clean up 1,000 years of legal garbage? Well, enter Emperor Justinian and his absolute genius of a legal minister, a guy named Tribonian. Let's see how they tackled this beast.
The scale of this job is just mind-boggling. The team was staring down a mountain of legal texts containing an estimated 3 million lines of law. 3 million. This came from thousands of different books of opinions and commentaries. It was a library so huge and so contradictory, no single human could ever hope to understand it all.
And yet, they did it. They took that entire forest of text and boiled it all down to just 150,000 essential lines. And get this, Tribonian's team read, sorted, and streamlined a whole millennium of law. And they did it in only 3 years. 3! That's an absolutely stunning achievement.
So what they did wasn't just tidying up. They built a whole new foundation. They gave Roman law 3 solid pillars. First, the Code, which gathered up all the imperial laws into one place. Second, the Pandects, or the Digest, which was like the greatest hits of Rome's best legal thinkers. And third, the Institutes, which was basically the official textbook for law students. For the very first time, Roman law actually made sense. It was rational, it was teachable.
Okay, so we've seen how they organized it, but what did these laws actually say? How did they affect the daily lives of Romans when it came to the really big stuff, like family, power, and crime?
Right at the very core of Roman family law is one of the most, well, jaw-dropping concepts: patria potesta, paternal power. This meant a Roman father had complete and total lifelong control over his children. Even if his son was a 40-year-old war hero, in his father's house, that son was legally a thing. The law literally grouped him with the cattle and the slaves. And this is where it gets really, really weird. In a strange twist of logic, a slave who was freed by his master was actually in a better legal position than a son. See, a master could only free a slave once, and that was it. But a father, he could sell his own son into slavery 3 separate times before the son was finally legally free from his control. It's just bizarre.
So, what about crime and punishment? Well, the foundation of it all, the 12 tables, was, as Gibbon famously put it, written in characters of blood. The punishments were unbelievably brutal. If you lied under oath, they'd throw you off a cliff. If you committed arson, you were whipped and then burned alive. And the punishment for killing your own parent, I mean, this is horrifically specific. You were sewn into a leather sack with a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey, and then thrown into the sea.
Now all of this feels ancient, right? Foreign, maybe a little horrifying. But here's the thing. The legal system that Justinian organized didn't just vanish with the Roman Empire. Its ghost, in a lot of ways, is still walking among us.
Justinian's code didn't just save Roman law, it exported it to the world. Gibbon says the public reason of the Romans was basically poured into the legal systems of Europe. It became the bedrock for what we now call civil law, which is a system used all over continental Europe, Latin America, and even in parts of Africa and Asia. Our modern ideas about contracts, property, and inheritance still have the fingerprints of ancient Rome all over them.
And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. We like to think our modern laws are all about reason and individual rights. But how much of our basic sense of justice, our very idea of what a law is really just an echo of this ancient code? A system born from 1,000 years of history, tamed by one emperor's incredible ambition. The ghost of Rome might be a lot closer than we think.
We're going to talk about how one really bad decision by an emperor, a pretty gruesome act of revenge with a human skull, and the total collapse of an army created a power vacuum that gave birth to the medieval papacy.
Okay, let's dive right in. The year is 566 in Constantinople. You've got these ambassadors from the Avar tribe. They were allies of the old emperor, Justinian. They show up to meet the new guy, Emperor Justin II, expecting the usual deal. Instead, Justin just lays into them with this incredibly arrogant speech. It's a moment of pure hubris that's going to kick off a domino effect across the entire Western world.
So back it up a year to 565 AD. The great Emperor Justinian, who'd ruled for almost 40 years, dies. His nephew, Justin II, takes over, and he is dead set on proving he is his own man. He talks a big game about restoring Roman glory, but right out of the gate, his first big move is all ego and zero strategy.
Look, Justinian's strategy was pretty simple. He paid the Avars to be a buffer on the frontier. Yeah, it was expensive, but it worked. It kept the peace. Justin II saw it as a sign of weakness. So in front of his entire court, he basically tells the Avar ambassadors to get lost. Stunned, the Avars just leave. And they immediately start looking for a new ally.
And wouldn't you know it, someone is waiting in the wings. This is Alboin, king of the Lombards. He's a warrior straight out of a saga. He's ambitious, he's ruthless, and he has a serious grudge against his neighbors, the Gepidae. And thanks to Emperor Justin's little tantrum, Alboin now has the perfect partner to help him settle a score.
Alboin's rise is just unbelievably fast and vicious. He makes a deal with the Avars. Help him crush the Gepidae, and the Avars can have their land. Together, they don't just defeat the Gepidae, they wipe them off the map. Alboin himself kills their king, Cunimund, and then forces the king's daughter, Rosamund, to marry him. And then, and you just can't make this stuff up, he has her father's skull hollowed out, mounted in gold, and uses it as his personal wine glass. So, with the Gepidae gone, Alboin is the undisputed top dog on the Danube. And he starts looking at a much bigger prize, Italy. It's rich, but more importantly, it's weak. The Roman Empire had only just taken it back, and now, thanks to some drama back in the palace, its defenses were about to completely fall apart.
And here's the second huge mistake made in Constantinople. The genius general Narses, the guy who actually reconquered Italy for the empire, gets recalled in disgrace. The Empress Sophia insults him, basically telling him to go back to sewing with the women. Narses, furious, sends back this threat. Now, whether he actually invited the Lombards in or not is debatable, but recalling him left Italy without its only competent defender at the absolute worst moment possible.
Alboin's invasion isn't even really a war, it's a tidal wave. In 568, he just rolls over the Alps with a massive army of Lombards, Saxons, you name it, anyone looking for plunder. The Roman government, with Narses gone, just melts away. Cities open their gates. In just a couple of years, the Lombards own almost all of northern and central Italy. It was shockingly easy.
So now Alboin is the king of Italy, living it up in his palace. He's at the absolute height of his power. But that incredible victory and that gruesome trophy, the Skull Cup, they carried the seeds of his own downfall. During a drunken feast, in a fit of unbelievable arrogance, Alboin calls for the Skull Cup. He drinks from it, and then he forces his wife, Queen Rosamond, to drink from it too, telling her to rejoice with her father. Rosamond obeys. She touches that horrible cup to her lips, and in that single moment of humiliation, she decides he has to die.
Rosamond's revenge is as cold and calculating as Alboin's cruelty was hot-headed. She finds a co-conspirator in the king's armor-bearer, seducing him to get him on her side. Then she just waits for the right moment when Alboin is passed out drunk from an afternoon feast.
While Alboin is asleep, Rosamond ties his own sword to its scabbard so he can't pull it out. Then she lets the killers in. He's helpless. So she gets her revenge. But politically, it's a total disaster. The Lombard kingdom was held together by this one guy. Without him, it just shatters into 30 different little territories, all run by warring dukes. Italy is plunged into chaos.
So, Italy, one of the empire's crown jewels, is being ripped to shreds by warlords. And you have to be asking yourself, where is the emperor? Where is the army? The short answer is, they're nowhere.
Well, the emperor who started all this, Justin II, was suffering from a mental illness that basically took him out of the picture. His successors, they were decent leaders, but they were stuck in a massive existential war with Persia over in the east. They had no troops, no money, nothing to send to Italy. Their official policy, and this is wild, was basically to tell the Romans, hey, maybe you can bribe the Lombards or hire someone else to fight them for you. The great Roman Empire could offer nothing but thoughts and prayers.
And so the city of Rome is left completely on its own. By the year 590, it had hit absolute rock bottom. It wasn't just the threat of attack, the city itself was just falling apart. This was a total failure of the state.
I mean, the place was a wreck. The river had flooded, which kicked off a plague. There was a famine because no food could get in. The city was practically a ghost town. As one writer put it, the people who were left would shut or open their gates with a trembling hand. With the government gone, Rome was on the brink of just disappearing.
This power vacuum created a really stark contrast. On one side, you have the emperor. He's far away, he's still demanding taxes, but he offers zero real help. His power is just an idea. On the other side, you have the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. He's actually in the city with the suffering people, and he starts doing the things a government is supposed to do.
That man was Pope Gregory the Great. He was this rich Roman noble who gave it all up to be a monk. He truly did not want to be pope, but in this desperate moment, he was the man for the job. Now, he didn't have an army, but what the church did have was land, huge estates all over Italy and Sicily. Gregory got them organized to ship food to Rome and feed the starving. He took command of the local defenses. He basically became the city's ruler.
So when the Lombards showed up again right at the gates of Rome, Gregory didn't wait for an order from the emperor that was never going to come. He went out himself to meet the Lombard king. He used diplomacy, his own charisma, and, seasonable gifts, which is a nice way of saying a giant pile of cash from the church treasury, and he convinced them to leave. He saved Rome when the emperor couldn't. And in doing that, he created a whole new kind of power in the West, one based on leadership, not legions.
And there you have it. From one emperor's pride to a barbarian king's fury to a queen's revenge. A chain of events was set off that completely shattered Roman rule in Italy. That collapse created a huge void, and into that void stepped the Bishop of Rome.
The worldly power of the papacy, the power that would shape Europe for the next 1,000 years, wasn't born from some grand ambition. It was born out of necessity, right in the ruins of an empire that could no longer protect its own.
What we're talking about today isn't just a war. It was something more. It was the apocalyptic final act of a rivalry that had defined the known world for 700 years. This is the story of the last great war of antiquity, a conflict so total, so unbelievably destructive, that it brought an entire era to a close.
You know, the great historian Edward Gibbon really put it best. This wasn't some short-term rivalry. We're talking centuries. Since the days of the Roman Republic, these two superpowers, Rome in the West, Persia in the East, had been locked in this epic struggle. They were like the two suns in the sky, and they were about to try and extinguish each other for good. But right before this final world-ending war, there was this brief, really extraordinary period of peace. And it was all built on the personal relationship between two men, the Roman Emperor Maurice and the young Persian king Chosroes II. Okay, so let's break this down because it's pretty wild. Chosroes II didn't just see Maurice as an ally, he literally owed him his crown. See, there was a rebellion back in Persia, and the young king had to flee for his life. And where does he go? To his mortal enemies, the Romans. But Emperor Maurice doesn't just give him a place to crash, he gives him an army, marches into Persia, crushes the rebellion, and puts Chosroes right back on his throne. He basically adopted him. And for years, that personal bond, that gratitude, kept the peace between these two massive empires. But here's the thing about a peace that's built on just one man's life. It's incredibly fragile. And in the year 602, that entire foundation was just shattered by a bloody, brutal coup right in the heart of Constantinople. And it all went down so fast you wouldn't believe it. An unpopular order to the army on the Danube frontier sparks a full-blown rebellion. A low-ranking centurion, a guy named Phocas, is suddenly hailed as the new emperor, and just days later, Maurice, the legitimate emperor, is dragged out of a church and brutally executed along with his 5 sons. He was forced to watch every single one of them die before they killed him. It was horrific. So, for Chosroes, over in Persia, this wasn't just politics. This was personal. This was patricide. The man who had saved his life, his father Maurice, had been butchered by a usurper. So he declares himself the Avenger, and with the entire might of the Persian Empire at his back, he unleashes a war of revenge that would bring the Roman world to its very knee. Now, under this incompetent new tyrant, Phocas, the Roman military, which was already pretty stretched thin, it just completely buckled. The Persian invasion wasn't just a success, it was an avalanche. The result was a catastrophe of just stunning speed. Entire regions, the absolute heartlands of the Eastern Roman Empire, fell one after another. Syria, gone. Palestine, gone. And then Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, the place that fed Constantinople, it was conquered. Within a decade, Persian soldiers were camped at Chalcedon, literally looking across the water at the capital itself. The end was in sight. And this wasn't some clean war of conquest. No, it was a war of annihilation. When the Persians took the holy city of Jerusalem in 614, it was an absolute bloodbath. Some sources from the time claim as many as 90,000 Christians were massacred. The human cost was just staggering. But for the Romans, maybe the biggest blow of all was spiritual. The Persians seized the most sacred relic in all of Christendom, the true cross, believed to be the actual cross that Jesus was crucified on. They took it. They carried it back to Persia as a trophy. Can you imagine the psychological shock? It must have felt like God himself had abandoned them. Right when it looks like it's all over, when all hope is lost, a new emperor arrives, Heraclius. He sails from Africa, overthrows the tyrant Phocas, and basically inherits a world on fire. He was the emperor of an empire that barely even existed anymore. Heraclius tries to do the sensible thing. He sends envoys to Chosroes, begging for peace, any kind of peace. But the Persian king, he's just drunk on victory. And the reply he sends back is bone-chilling. He doesn't want money, he wants total surrender. He demands that Heraclius renounce Christianity and worship the Persian sun god. So negotiation was out. This was now a fight to the death. So Heraclius, with his back against the wall, comes up with one of the most audacious, some would say insane plans in military history. First, to fund the war, he basically gets a massive loan from the church, melting down its gold and silver treasures.
Then, instead of fighting the Persians where they were, he puts his entire army on ships, sails right past them, and lands deep in their rear to strike directly at the Persian heartland. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. And the crazy thing is, it worked. For 6 straight years, Heraclius campaigns deep inside enemy territory, turning the Persian hunters into the hunted. He completely flips the script on the entire war. Now, Heraclius wasn't some emperor commanding from a comfy tent in the rear. No way. He was leading from the absolute front. At the decisive Battle of Nineveh, in a scene that's straight out of the Iliad, he personally challenges the Persian general, a guy named Rhazates, to single combat and kills him. It was this moment of pure heroism that just electrified his army and shattered Persian morale. The Roman army, the same army that was cowering behind its walls just a few years earlier, is now marching at will through Persia. They sack the king's favorite palace, a place filled with unimaginable wealth. And, just as important, they get back hundreds of Roman military standards that had been lost in all those earlier defeats. Vengeance was being repaid, in full. So the Persian war machine, and the will of its arrogant king, it finally breaks. The Roman Empire is saved from annihilation. But this victory, as total and as stunning as it seemed, came at a terrifying, unseen price. Defeated, disgraced, Chosroes ends up getting a taste of his own medicine. He's overthrown by his own nobles and his own son. In this grim, poetic echo of what happened to Maurice, he's thrown into a dungeon and murdered. The Avenger meets the exact same end as the man he claimed to be avenging. I mean, the reversal of fortunes here is just absolute. On the surface, it looks like the greatest Roman triumph imaginable. Heraclius is a conquering hero. The true cross is returned to Jerusalem in a massive ceremony. Meanwhile, Persia completely collapses into anarchy and civil war, its royal family tearing itself apart. You couldn't write a more complete victory. But here's the real point. Here's the kicker. Yeah, Rome had won, but this quarter century of just relentless, total war had bled both empires completely white. Their treasuries were empty, their best soldiers were dead, their lands were ruined. They had fought each other to a point of mutual exhaustion, leaving both of them critically, fatally wounded. So you've just created this massive power vacuum. The two titans that had dominated the world for centuries are now just hollowed-out shells of what they once were. The old order is broken, which leaves just one question hanging over all the ruins. And Gibbon gives us the chilling answer. While Heraclius was celebrating his incredible victory, a small, seemingly meaningless raid took place on the empire's southern border. Nobody paid it much mind, it was a minor nuisance. But it wasn't. Those raiders, they were the vanguard of a new, unforeseen force rising from the Arabian desert, united by the new faith of Islam. And into the vacuum created by the mutual destruction of Rome and Persia, they would explode onto the world stage. The last great war of antiquity didn't decide a winner. It just cleared the board for a whole new game.
How do ideas actually change the world? You might think of big inventions, or bloody revolutions, but sometimes the most earth-shattering conflicts don't start on a battlefield. They start with an argument over a single word. This is the story of how a debate over the nature of Christ didn't just create some new religious rules, it literally tore an empire apart, pitting powerful church leaders against each other in a struggle that was just as much about earthly ambition as it was about heavenly truth.
All right, let's jump right in with the great historian Edward Gibbon. He noticed something really interesting. Once paganism was finally defeated, you'd expect peace, right? But instead, Christians turned that intellectual fury on themselves. Suddenly, the big question wasn't if you believed in Christ, but how you believed in him. And as Gibbon points out, maybe a little cynically, they got way more obsessed with defining their founder than actually, following his teachings.
And this really gets us to the heart of it. I mean, how is this even possible? It seems crazy to us today, but for 2.5 centuries, this one argument just raged across the Roman Empire. And we're not just talking about scholars and monasteries. No, this stuff spilled out into the streets, it fueled riots, and it caused these deep, painful splits in the church that have lasted to this very day. So how on earth did a seemingly abstract idea get so powerful?
Well, the whole thing really boiled down to one fundamental problem. How do you define Jesus Christ? Was he a man who somehow became divine? Was he a God who only looked human, or was he something else, something in between? Finding the right words for this incredible mystery wasn't just a debate, it became a high-stakes war for the very soul of the faith.
So early on, you had these two extremes, and the mainstream church saw both of them as heresies. On one side, you had groups like the Ebionites. For them, Jesus was fundamentally a mortal man,
a prophet, a friend and countryman. But on the other side, you had the deceits, and they just couldn't wrap their heads around a perfect celestial being mixing with impure human flesh. So for them, Christ was this divine phantom, an illusion. The official church had to somehow navigate a path right down the middle of these two ideas.
And the entire massive conflict just exploded over this single Greek word, Theotokos. It means God-bearer, or, as it's often translated, Mother of God. This one word became the ultimate litmus test. Think about it. If you called Mary Theotokos, you were saying her son was fully God from the moment of conception. But if you rejected it, well, that implied you were splitting Christ into two separate beings, the man Jesus and the divine spirit that lived inside him. The whole fight was packed into that one single word.
And, you guessed it, this war of words very quickly became a war of men. This wasn't just some polite philosophical disagreement. No, this was a political deathmatch between two of the most powerful churchmen in the entire empire. And their rivalry, it was fueled by pure ambition, envy, and the raw struggle for influence over the emperor himself.
First up, we have Cyril, the Patriarch of Alexandria. Now, he's remembered today as a saint, but as Gibbon makes very clear, that's pretty much just because his side won. In reality, he was a brilliant and an absolutely ruthless political operator. He had learned the arts of, as Gibbon puts it, zeal and dominion from his uncle, who was just as formidable.
Cyril's time in power in Alexandria was anything but saintly. I mean, look at this. He drove out the city's huge Jewish population, seized churches from his Christian rivals, and used mobs of fanatical monks to terrorize anyone who got in his way. And most infamously, he was tied to the absolutely horrific lynching of Hypatia, a brilliant female philosopher. Her chariot was ambushed, she was dragged into a church, stripped naked, and then butchered with oyster shells. This was the man fighting for the title Mother of God.
And his rival? Nestorius, the patriarch of the imperial capital itself, Constantinople. He was a monk from Antioch, famous for his fiery sermons and his really rigid intolerance. He despised the word Theotokos. He argued that Mary gave birth to the man, Jesus, not to God himself. And this uncompromising, stubborn position made him the absolute perfect target for a guy like Cyril.
And if you want a perfect snapshot of his mindset, here it is. These were his first words to the Emperor Theodosius. There was just no room for negotiation in his world. He saw heresy hiding around every corner, and he truly believed it was his divine mission to stamp it all out. The incredible irony, of course, is that the very sword of persecution he was so eager to use would soon be turned right back on him.
So the whole thing finally came to a head in the year 431. The emperor calls a general council in the city of Ephesus to settle it, once and for all. It was supposed to be this moment of holy, thoughtful deliberation. Instead, as Gibbon so perfectly calls it, it was an episcopic tumult. Just a chaotic, ugly spectacle of bribery, intimidation, and outright violence.
The council unfolded like a straight-up political coup. First, Cyril gets there early with his whole crew, and knowing that Nestorius' allies were running late, he just illegally starts the meeting. He acts as the judge and the prosecutor, condemning Nestorius in a single day. Well, when Nestorius' allies finally show up, they are furious. So what do? They hold their own counter-council and depose Cyril. The whole thing was such a complete farce that the emperor just dissolved it and had both of them arrested.
You see, this wasn't about theology anymore. This was pure, raw hatred. This quote from the Eastern bishops just shows you how personal and venomous this had all become. They didn't just think Cyril was wrong. They saw him as a literal monster, a force of pure destruction sent to ruin the church.
So how did Cyril manage to turn his arrest into a total victory? Well, in a word, gold. While Nestorius was in jail waiting for some kind of justice, Cyril's agents in the capital launched a massive bribery campaign. And we're talking a staggering 60,000 pounds of gold. It bankrupted the Church of Alexandria, all to make sure the emperor would condemn and exile Nestorius for good.
But Cyril's victory, won through bribes and violence, it didn't bring peace. Not even close. It just made the wounds deeper. The question of Christ's nature just refused to go away, and it led to more councils, more violence, and in the end, a permanent fracture in the Christian world.
The chaos just kept escalating. 18 years after Ephesus, there was an even more violent council, later nicknamed the Robber Synod, where one patriarch was actually beaten to death. The turmoil got so bad that a new emperor had to step in and try one last time for peace, calling a new council at Chalcedon in 451 to try and impose a final solution.
And this is the compromise they landed on. Christ is one person who exists in two natures. It's a carefully worded formula that tried to give something to both sides. But, as Gibbon so brilliantly describes it, it was like a bridge as sharp as a razor, just suspended over this giant abyss. It was a theological tightrope walk that, in the end, didn't really satisfy anybody.
And here are the real, long-term consequences. Huge parts of the Christian world, especially in the East, just flat-out rejected this compromise. The followers of Nestorius, who'd fled to Persia, formed the Church of the East, and those who stuck to Cyril's one-nature idea, they became the Coptic, the Syriac, and the Armenian Orthodox churches. This wasn't a temporary spat, it was a permanent schism. And these churches, they all exist today, a living legacy of this ancient fight. What's just staggering is how permanent this division became. Writing over 1,300 years later, Gibbon could see that the fire lit by that one sermon from Nestorius was still burning. The lines drawn by Cyril and Nestorius at Ephesus and Chalcedon, they never healed. They became permanent fixtures of the Christian world map.
So we're left with this really unsettling question, aren't we? The story of Cyril and Nestorius, it seems like it's about theology, about the deepest mysteries of faith. But it's also a story of raw ambition, of political maneuvering, of backstabbing and violence. It really forces us to ask, in the grand drama of history, does power just serve belief, or does belief eventually become just another tool, a justification for the timeless pursuit of power?